This is My Friends Call Me Monster, Book 7 in the Goosebumps Horrorland series by R.L. Stine. Chapter 13. Dad's onion tears rolled down his cheeks and he laughed. Mom laughed too. I stood there still breathing hard, my legs trembling. I gritted my teeth and watched them laugh at me. Michael, we know you don't like your teacher, Mom said finally, and yes, I'll admit she's a little different. But there's no point in making up crazy stories about her, Dad said. Mom tapped me on the head with her long wooden spoon. Good imagination, she said. Why don't you sit down at your computer and write up that story, Dad added. Maybe you're going to be a science fiction writer. Ugh! I let out an angry cry. It's not science fiction, I screamed. It's real. I could feel myself start to lose it. I almost grabbed the spoon out of Mom's hand and tossed it out the window. Almost. I caught myself in time. I balled my hands into tight fists at my sides and stomped out of the kitchen. When those disgusting monsters and Mrs. H and her commander ran the world, it wouldn't be so funny, would it? I stormed into my room and slammed the door behind me. I tossed my backpack onto the bed and started pacing furiously back and forth. Who would believe me? Would Daisy and Dwayne believe me? Maybe, but who cared? They couldn't help. I needed to find someone who could stop Mrs. Hardesty. Mr. Wong? Maybe. The town police? Maybe. The National Guard unit my cousin Brad is in? Maybe. But they wouldn't believe me either. No one would believe me unless I had proof. I banged my forehead against the wall. I had my cell phone with me in the attic. Why didn't I take pictures? Why? Now I knew what I had to do. I had to go back there and take a good, clear picture with those monsters. Of those monsters. Then people would have to believe me. I shuddered. I had no choice. I was the only one in the world who knew about Mrs. Hardesty's plot. I was the only one who could stop her. I sat down at my counter. I IM'd Daisy and Dwayne. I asked them to come with me, back to Mrs. H's house. I told them it was a total emergency. They both said no. Dwayne wrote, "Sounds like a bad plan. No way I'm ever going back on her block again." Daisy wrote a very short message. "Allergic to giant eggs. Sorry." Okay. I was on my own. I can do this, I told myself. They don't call me monster for nothing. Saturday morning, I checked out the camera in my cell phone. I snapped some shots of Mom and Dad at breakfast, just to make sure it was working. Then I tucked it carefully into my jeans pocket. Mom and Dad hurried off to play their Saturday morning golf. I hurried off to save the world. Mrs. Hardesty's blue Civic wasn't in her driveway. Was she away? I circled the house a few times to make sure. No signs of life. Nothing moving. I crept up close to the front and peered into the living room window. I saw a newspaper folded up on the couch, a coffee mug on the table beside it. No Mrs. Hardesty. I crossed my fingers. Maybe she was out shopping for more meat or something. I could just slip down to the basement, take a bunch of photos, and leave. Maybe. I crept around to the back. I peeked into the kitchen window. Oh! I uttered a cry and dropped to the ground. A green monster was standing in the kitchen, staring right out at me. Chapter 14. I hunched below the window, squeezing myself into a tight ball, and waited for the creature to stick its head out the window, or to come flying out the back door to grab me. But no. After a minute or so, I realized it probably hadn't seen me, so I took a deep breath and pulled myself back up to the window. The monster stood over the stove. It had a long white spatula tucked in one claw. It was stirring something in a big frying pan. Eggs? I squinted through the window. Yes, it was cooking up a big pan of eggs. Now it had its back to me. I straightened up a little higher to see better. How did it escape from the basement? And how did it know how to cook? 1,000 questions whirred through my mind. I shook them away and reached into my jeans for my phone. I raised the phone to the window and steadied it. No good. Too dark in the kitchen. I clicked the phone shut and shoved it back into my jeans pocket. I pressed my nose against the window. I watched the monster stir the eggs with the long spatula, and then the creature stuck out its other claw. It grabbed up a big hunk of egg and slid it into its mouth. It turned to the side. I could see the smile on its snout as it chewed. It chewed the eggs for a short while, then swallowed, and instantly the monster began to change. Its whole shape wriggled and pulled in. Its green head shrunk and shifted until it became a human head. In seconds, the monster transformed into Mrs. Hardesty. I gasped. I nearly hit my head on the window. Mrs. Hardesty was a monster too. The eggs changed her back to her human body. If only I had taken a picture. If only Daisy and Dwayne had come with me. I'd have witnesses. I'd have proof. I watched Mrs. Hardesty reach into the pan. She picked up another chunk of scrambled egg. She took a big bite. In seconds, she stood there, a monster again. Another bite of egg, and she transformed back into Mrs. Hardesty. Wow, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But I realized how powerful those eggs were. They could turn you from a monster into a human and back again in seconds. No one will ever believe this, I muttered to myself, and she planned to bring these eggs to school and feed them to everyone. I slid down to the ground. I sat with my back to the wall, trying to think, trying to make a plan. How could I get pictures of this without being caught? Even with the pictures, would anyone believe the power of the eggs? I shook my head, trying to clear my brain, and the back door swung open. Mrs. Hardesty stepped out onto the stoop. "Michael," she cried, "I thought I saw you. What are you doing here?" Chapter 15. I struggled to my feet. Panic froze my brain. She stared at me, gripping the spatula tightly in one hand. I needed help," I said finally, "with a homework assignment. I thought maybe you could help me." "On a Saturday morning?" she asked. "It's very early." "You're right," I said. "What was I thinking?" I started to walk away. "Come in, Michael," Mrs. Hardesty said. "Don't hurry away. You're just in time. I want you to try my special eggs." "Huh?" I gasped. "No way." I almost blurted out, "I saw what they do," but I stopped myself at the last second. "Come in, Michael." She held the door open. "I can't," I said. I'm late for something." Lame. How lame was that? "It will only take a second," Mrs. Hardesty said. "It's a new egg recipe. You'll be the first to try it." "No, I won't. I saw you try it." I think I might be allergic to eggs," I said. She laughed. "Not these eggs. These eggs are special." Then her smile faded. "Michael, get in here," she ordered. Before I knew it, I was sitting at her kitchen table. Her dark eyes flashed as she set a big plate of eggs down in front of me. "I'm so glad you stopped by," she said. I gulped and gazed down at the eggs. They were fluffy and bright yellow. They didn't smell like eggs. They smelled like kind of hay and fertilizer. You know, that smell when you drive past a farm in the summer? "I can't," I said. "I'm sorry. I had a huge breakfast." I started to stand up, but Mrs. Hardesty leaned over me, forcing me to sit back down. She took a fork and scooped up a chunk of egg. Then she slid the fork into my mouth. "Eat up, Michael," she said softly. Her breath brushed my ear. "Delicious, right?" I didn't want to swallow, but the egg slid down my tongue. It tasted like chalk, very dry. My heart started to do a tap dance in my chest. My ears tingled. Mrs. Hardesty forced another forkful down my throat. I was terrified and angry at the same time. She tried to feed me more. I shoved her hand away. The eggs went flying across the table. Too late, I realized. I already felt strange. My whole body tingled. My skin felt rubbery. I shuddered. "You've been a lot of trouble, Michael," Mrs. Hardesty said softly. She backed away. Her face was twisted in excitement. "You've been a lot of trouble to me, haven't you?" she said. "But from now on, I think we're going to get along just fine." "No," I tried to cry out, but only a hoarse croak escaped my throat. I felt my arms shrinking, my hands folding into my wrists. I raised them and groaned. My skin was green and covered in bumps. In place of fingers, I had claws. My stomach lurched. Strange sounds burst from my open mouth. I felt my face changing. I reached up and wrapped a claw around my long snout. A long, dry snake tongue whipped out of my mouth. I leaped up from the kitchen table. I jumped right out of my clothes. My chair went flying backward. I tried to run and tripped over my jeans. My lizardy body heaved in and out. I'm a monster, I realized. It took only 2 little forkfuls, and I'm a monster. I staggered back on my stubby legs. I felt sick. The room became a black and white blur. My tongue slid in and out. Mrs. Hardesty tossed back her head and laughed. "You look wonderful, Michael," she said. She slapped my green bumpy back. I couldn't make words. "You're my little baby now," Mrs. Hardesty said. "I'm going to keep you nice and safe with my other little babies. Won't that be fun?" She dug her nails into my shoulders as she forced me down to the basement stairs. Blocking my escape, she unlocked the door and pushed me in with the other monsters. "See you later, little babies," she cooed. "Mama's going out to shop for supplies. I'm going to scramble up a big egg on Monday, big enough for the whole school." She laughed a cold laugh. "Who said teachers don't have fun?" She slammed the door. I heard the click of the lock. I spun away from the door and glanced around the room. Was there a window I could escape through? Another door? I had to get out of there and warn everyone. She was planning to turn their whole school into monsters on Monday. I shut my eyes, trying to think. Even if I escaped, how could I warn everyone? I couldn't even speak. Besides, who would listen to a lizarded green monster? When I opened my eyes, I had a surprise. The other monsters had lined up. They stood in a straight line, staring at me. Their tongues flicked in and out. They lowered their heads, opened their jaws, and uttered low growls. Not friendly. I didn't need any hints. I could see they weren't happy about me. "Dudes, I'm on your side." That's what I wanted to say. Instead, it came out "Urf, urf." I started to back toward the door, but they moved quickly. They slid across the floor and formed a circle around me. I raised both front claws. I surrender. It didn't impress them. The circle grew tighter as they closed in on me. Closer, closer. I was trapped in the middle, nowhere to run. Their growls grew louder, and what was that snapping sound? Their jaws moved hungrily. I gritted my teeth. I held my breath, and they pounced. Chapter 16. As they dove for me, I dropped to my stomach and hit the floor. To my surprise, I heard the lock click on the other side of the door, and the door swung open. The sudden movement made the monsters pull back. Daisy and Dwayne poked their heads into the room. "Michael, are you in here?" Daisy called. "We've been looking everywhere." She stopped. They both let out horrified cries when they saw they had stepped into a room full of monsters. I was so happy to see them, my rescuers. I stuck out my arms and went running to hug my friends. A huge mistake. They screamed again. "What would you do if you saw a 6-foot-tall monster running at you?" Dwayne pulled back his arm and gave me a hard punch under the snout. The punch sent me flying back. The pain shot down my body. I dropped to my knees. Daisy and Dwayne gaped down at me. I waited for the room to stop spinning. The other monsters were huffing and puffing again, hopping up and down excitedly. "It's me, Michael," I shouted to Daisy and Dwayne, but it came out Urf. How could I make them understand? How could I show them it was me? I knew I only had a few seconds. My two horrified friends were already backing out of the room. Once they closed the door, I'd be trapped, and no one would be able to stop Mrs. Hardesty and her egg plot. How could I let them know? Something gleamed on the floor right outside the door. I squinted at it. Something silvery. It took me a moment to realize it was my dog whistle. So that's what fell from my pocket when we were down here with the black cat. I stood up and moved slowly to it. With a quick swipe of my claw, I grabbed the whistle off the floor. Please, I thought, please, let Daisy and Dwayne figure out that it's me. I sucked in a deep breath, raised the dog whistle to my snout, and started to blow. Then I waved it in the air so they could see it. Then I blew some more. Please, please. Chapter 17. I waved the whistle at them. Did they recognize it? I blew it some more. Daisy and Dwayne had backed to the door. They stared at me, their faces scrunched up in confusion. I blew another long blast. To my shock, the monsters all started to whimper. They curled up on themselves, trying to cover their ears. All of them were shaking and quaking. Wow, I thought, they definitely don't like high-pitched sounds. It hurt my ears too, but I blew the whistle again. The monsters hunched over, trembling, whimpering softly. "Michael, is that really you?" Daisy called. "Are you nuts?" Dwayne snapped at her. "That's not Michael. That's a monster, waving a dog whistle at us." I cried. I raised the whistle to Daisy. I pointed it at myself. Sign language, desperate sign language. "We're out of here," Dwayne cried. "They're going to eat us or something." But Daisy kept staring hard at me. "Michael?" I nodded. I took a bow. I nodded some more. I waved the dog whistle in front of her. "We've been looking everywhere for you," Daisy cried. She realized it was me. "Did Mrs. Hardesty do this to you?" I nodded some more. Dwayne was starting to believe me too. He pointed to the others. "Mrs. Hardesty hatched all of these from giant eggs?" I nodded again. I knew there wasn't time for any more questions. Mrs. H would be back from the store at any minute. I lowered my head and took off running. I burst between my two friends and out the door. My lizardy feet pounded the stairs up to the kitchen. Daisy and Dwayne followed after me. No sign of Mrs. Hardesty. Now what? I was free, out of the basement room, but no way I could tell the whole story while I was still a monster. My eyes darted around the kitchen. I saw my jeans and t-shirt piled in a corner. Then I gazed at the stove. The eggs. Were there any eggs left in the pan? I pushed my two friends out of the way and stomped to the stove. "Michael, what are you doing?" Daisy cried. I looked down at the frying pan. Just a tiny chunk of egg left. A teaspoonful, stuck to the bottom. Was it enough to turn me back into me? It had to be. I lowered my face to the pan, flicked out my snaky tongue, and wrapped it around the little piece of egg. I pulled it into my mouth and swallowed. "Yes, come on, change, Michael, change." I waited. Nothing happened. Chapter 18. No, wait. My stomach started to churn. The room tilted and swayed, and my skin heated up. I felt as if my whole body was melting to the floor. I looked down. I still had claws. My lizard arms were green and bumpy, but my legs were back. My feet. I stomped hard on the floor. Yes, my feet were there. I hurried to the corner and pulled on my clothes. Then I trotted to the hall mirror and gasped. "Michael," Daisy cried, "you're back." "Kinda," Dwayne added. I stared in the mirror. My face, my head, they were back, but my neck and chest were green. I still had monster arms and claws. "Not enough eggs," the word burst from my throat in a growl. "I need more eggs." I dove back to the stove. I scraped the bottom of the pan with my claws. I pulled the pan off the stove and flipped it upside down. No, none left. I turned and saw my two friends staring at me in horror. "Michael, how did this happen to you?" Daisy cried. "No time to explain," I said. "Mrs. Hardesty will be back any second." But you're still half monster," Dwayne exclaimed. I rolled my eyes. "Tell me something I don't know." "But I don't understand," Daisy said, shaking her head. "Are you—" "We'll talk later. We've got to get help right away," I said. "Mrs. Hardesty is a monster, too. She and her commander have a terrible plan. She's going to make a big batch of her eggs for the whole class. They plan to turn everyone in town into monsters." They both squinted at me. "Everyone in town?" Dwayne asked. I headed to the back door. "Who can help us?" I asked. "Who?" "How about Mr. Wong?" Daisy said. "He lives down the street, remember?" "Yeah," Dwayne said. "Wong said to come to him if we have a problem, and we definitely have a problem." "Okay, it's a plan," I said. "Let's do it." I grabbed the doorknob with one claw and pulled open the kitchen door. Bright sunlight greeted us as we ran out into the backyard. I saw someone's big golden lab sprawled on its back in the driveway. Squirrels darted for the trees when they saw us. We ran to the back of the yard. This big garbage dumpster was still in the lot. Someone had leaned a bike with no tires against it. We crossed the lot and made our way to Mr. Wong's yard. My legs felt trembly and strange. I think they were still part monster legs. Suddenly, I heard low grunts and growls behind us, and the thunder of heavy feet against the ground. "Look!" Dwayne spun around and pointed. "Oh, no!" I turned and saw the big green monsters lumbering after us. They moved in twos and threes, stumbling forward on their hind legs, eyes half shut in the bright sunlight. Had they ever seen the sun before? "We left the basement door open," Daisy said. "They're following us." The monsters began to growl. They barred their teeth as they lumbered after us, some of them chewing up big clumps of dirt and grass and spit them at us. "We can't outrun them," Dwayne murmured. A wet clump of dirt smacked me in the back. I shook it off. "Not a problem," I cried. "We're almost at Mr. Wong's house. When Mr. Wong sees them, he'll have to believe our story. He'll have to help us." Mr. Wong had a small square house with red brick walls and white shutters on all the windows. A small satellite dish stood behind the garage. A vegetable garden stretched across the back. I almost stumbled over a rake half hidden by the tall grass as I ran around the front. He had a big screened porch facing the street. It was empty. I climbed the front stoop and rang the bell with one claw. As we waited, the monsters lined up behind us in the grass. They snapped their jaws, preparing to attack. Thick drool ran down their jagged teeth. They pawed the ground impatiently. Then they came at us, a step at a time. Closer, closer. I kept glancing behind me as I rang the bell again and again. The principal didn't answer. "He's got to be home," I boomed. "This is an emergency. These monsters are hungry." The monster part of me suddenly took over. I lowered my big shoulder to the door and rammed it with my monster strength. The door cracked open. I led the way inside. Mr. Wong's living room was dark and silent. The curtains were pulled and the lights were off. I saw a pile of school books on the coffee table. I started to call his name, then stopped. I saw a light in the next room and heard voices. I moved toward it. The room had a big flat-screen TV on the wall, and an old black-and-white movie was on. I stepped closer. I saw a dark couch and a big armchair, and then, in the doorway to the TV room, I turned to my friends. "I don't think Mr. Wong is going to be of any help to us," I whispered. Their faces filled with surprise. "Why not?" Daisy asked. I moved back so they could see in the corner, and there sat Mr. Wong right on top of a giant egg. Chapter 19. He had his eyes closed. He didn't see us staring at him in shock from the doorway. He had his suit jacket off. His tie was loosened. Perched on top of the egg, he leaned his back against the wall. His hands were clasped in his lap. The egg was twice as big as the one Mrs. Hardesty had. "Wow," Dwayne whispered, shaking his head. "He's hatching eggs too. Do you believe it?" "Let's get out of here," I whispered. Daisy, Dwayne, and I turned to leave, but our path was blocked. The snarling monsters had followed us inside. Snapping their jaws, drooling, they pushed into the small living room. They knocked over the tables and chairs and tore the carpet with their sharp claws. As I stared in horror, they squeezed closer, forcing us back into the TV room. "We're trapped," Daisy whispered. "We can't get out." "They're going to crush us," Dwayne cried. "Crush us and then eat us." I turned back to Mr. Wong. How could he sleep through this? We had no choice. "We have to run through the monsters," I said. "No other way out." But before we could move, I heard the front door slam. A few seconds later, Mrs. Hardesty stepped into the room. She carried a platter heaped high with scrambled eggs. Mrs. H had a big smile on her face as she entered, but it faded instantly when she saw the room of monsters. Her mouth dropped open in an O of shock, and she nearly dropped the egg platter. The monsters forgot about us and turned to greet her. Daisy, Dwayne, and I scrunched down and hid behind the monsters. They began jumping up and down with excitement and making shrill crying noises. But she wasn't happy to see them. "How did you escape?" she cried. "Who let you out?" And then she shouted to the sleeping principal, "Commander Zanks, wake up!" Behind us, on top of his eggs, Mr. Wong blinked a few times. "Commander, what is happening here?" Mrs. Hardesty shouted. My babies have escaped." Daisy, Dwayne, and I exchanged glances. So Mr. Wong was Commander Zanks. My babies, Mrs. Hardesty cried. "How did you get over here?" Daisy, Dwayne, and I tried to scrunch down even more, but it didn't take long for Mrs. Hardesty to spot us. Her pale face darkened. Her eyes narrowed. "You," she screamed, "you evil kids, let them out!" Behind us, Mr. Wong shook himself awake. "What is happening here?" he called. "Hyborg, is that you?" Balancing the egg platter in one hand, Mrs. Hardesty pointed to her monsters. "Attack those kids," she ordered them in a deep growl. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around quickly. How to escape? Mr. Wong behind us, Mrs. Hardesty and the monsters in front of us. It didn't look good. "Attack those kids," Mrs. Hardesty screamed. "Protect the commander. I order you to attack." The monsters tossed back their heads and roared. The noise shook the room. I felt weak, trapped, nowhere to move. Snapping their jaws, rolling their eyes wildly, they came to us. Chapter 20. I felt something explode in my chest. Was it fear? Was it anger? I didn't have time to think about it. I only knew that I wasn't going to stand there and let Mrs. Hardesty's monsters attack us. I was still only half human, and as the monsters lumbered forward, I let the beast in me take over. "They call me monster," I cried, "and I am a monster." With an animal cry, I spun around and slammed my claws into the giant eggshell. Mr. Wong uttered a startled shout. His arms flew up as the eggshell cracked. The crack was loud enough to silence the monsters. I saw the jagged line spread down the egg from top to bottom, and then with another loud crack, the top of the shell fell in. Mr. Wong uttered a cry. His hand shot straight up in the air, and he dropped into the egg. He made a loud splash. He kicked out a small, jagged piece of shell. I could see him thrashing and kicking under the thick yellow yolk. His head sank under the yellow yolk slime and then slid up again. He was sputtering and choking. He sank again, then pushed his face above the thick surface. "I can't swim," he screamed. "Get me out of here. I can't swim. Hyborg, help me." "Coming, Commander," she cried. She dove toward the egg, but the monster anger still burned in my chest. I lifted Mrs. Hardesty, or whatever her name was, off the floor with my claws. She squirmed and struggled, but I was too strong for her. I held her high and heaved her over the top into the giant egg. She made a big splash. She and Wong struggled, climbing over each other, twisting and kicking. Sputtering, they sank beneath the yellow yolk. Their mouths opened to scream. They swallowed egg yolk. As my friends and I stared in amazement, they both began to change. Their skin turned green. Their human faces shifted into green monster heads. Their bodies ballooned and twisted. And now we were watching two green monsters. Slapping their claws at each other, wrestling, snarling like beasts, they floundered and thrashed inside the egg. In seconds, they pulled each other down to the bottom of the egg. I couldn't see them through the thick yellow goo. Daisy, Duane, and I stood gaping at the egg, watching for them. Watching. They didn't come back up. Phew. I breathed a sigh of relief. The evil aliens had been defeated, thanks to me, Monster Monroe. Daisy and Duane flashed me the thumbs-up sign. But we had no time to celebrate. The other monsters remained silent for a few seconds more. They stared at the egg as if waiting for their two leaders to return. And then they opened their mouths in one long, angry roar. Their eyes turned red with fury. They raised their heads and snapped their jaws hungrily and came at us, their feet thudding on the carpet. I swallowed hard, watching them attack, and I thought, I can't fight them all, can I? Chapter 21. I planted my feet and raised my claws in front of me. I gritted my teeth and prepared for a battle. No need. The attacking monsters had no interest in my friends and me. They dove headfirst at the platter of eggs on the floor, snarling, snapping each other away, fighting, slurping loudly. They gobbled up the eggs. Daisy, Duane, and I didn't move. I kept my claws raised. I held my breath. I watched the monsters devour the eggs. Second later, their bodies began to change. Their green skin faded to a lighter shade. They turned yellow, and their skin began to bubble. They're turning to liquid, Duane cried. Yes, he was right. Their bones shrank. Their heads melted away. Their bodies plopped wetly to the floor. In seconds, they had become yellow puddles on the carpet. I knew what was happening. The eggs, they turn you back to what you were originally, I said. So the monsters turned back into egg yolks. We won! We beat them! Daisy cried, pumping her fists in the air. I tried to slap her a high five. Then I remembered I still had monster claws. One more thing to do, I said. I lowered my face to the giant cracked egg, and I licked some yolk off the shell. Yuck! It tasted totally gross. Lumpy like sour milk. I almost hurled, but I choked it down. Then I stared at my claws and waited. Yes! A few seconds later, my arms stretched out. My hands returned. My skin turned back to its original color. I'm a human again, I shouted, jumping up and down. I'm totally human. I don't want anyone to ever call me monster again. Stepping over the puddles of egg yolk, we stared toward the door. Can you believe it? Daisy said. We just saved the world from evil aliens. No one will ever believe it, I said. Duane stopped me at the door. Yes, they will, he said. I've got proof. He held up his cell phone and grinned. I've been snapping photos the whole time. I've got Mrs. Hardesty, the monsters, Mr. Wong, everything. Got it all right here. You do? I cried. I gave him a hard slap on the back. That's awesome. Let me see. I took the phone from him and flipped it open. I scrolled through his snapshots. All feet, just shoes. Duane's shoes, picture after picture. I handed the phone back to him. Duane, did you ever take pictures before with this phone? I asked. No, it's a new phone. He glanced through the snapshots. Then he shook his head sadly. Guess we don't have proof. Michael, I've never seen you eat like that, Mom exclaimed at dinner. Be careful. Don't eat the placemat. Dad laughed. Guess you worked up an appetite, huh? He said. Did you have a busy day? Yeah, kind of busy, I said. Of course, I didn't tell them about Commander Zanks or Hyborg, or their monsters, or saving the whole planet from evil aliens. I have no proof. What's for dessert? I asked. Mom sliced large pieces of cake for the three of us. I grabbed my fork and started to shovel it into my mouth. I'd never been so starving in my life, and this cake tasted awesome. The three of us ate in silence for a while. Isn't it good? Mom said. Mrs. Hardesty brought it over yesterday. Huh? I tried to talk, but I had a mouthful of cake. Wasn't that nice of her to bring us dessert? Mom said. She said she made it with her own special eggs. The end.